Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you very much for taking the time to join us today, a busy day, a budget day in the UK. But we're not going to talk about that. We're going to talk about international global affairs. And I'm particularly pleased that Sir Robin Niblett has been able to join us at the City UK for this roundtable. For those of you who don't know Sir Robin, he is a terrifically distinguished foreign affairs voice, has been director and CEO of Chatham House for 15 years, and is today a distinguished fellow with Chatham House, which is the shorthand for the Royal Institute of International Affairs, and also a senior advisor to Hakluyt, the London-based strategic advisory firm. Robin is a leading expert on relations between Europe, the US, and Asia, their implications for risk management by governments and by the private sector. He's the author of a terrific book, The New Cold War, How the Contest Between the US and China Will Shape Our Century. So we may well get into that during this conversation. He's also a senior advisor to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, the CSIS, a distinguished fellow of the Asia Society Policy Institute, and serves on the International Advisory Board of Brown Advisory, a US investment firm. So we couldn't be in better company this afternoon for a view of rising global tensions. So without further ado, Sir Robin, I'll hand over to you and let you make some opening remarks to get this conversation moving. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you for the opportunity to talk with you and your various colleagues and participants and guests of the City UK. Yes, it's interesting to be heading off-piste while sitting in London. As you can probably tell from where I'm sitting, this is definitely a London room I'm in, not my own, I might add, and not Chatham House's either. But I'm at a conference I'm attending right now, which is in a very nice venue. I think the topic that you've advertised for me to touch on today is part of what's going on outside the London bubble of the new Chancellor's first budget. And for me to sort of go into the big picture, as you said, of today's geopolitics, not least as we have another big event happening in America, which has global implications next week on the 5th of November, Tuesday, when we will find out who the new US president will be in January of 2025, if all goes according to plan, of course. So what I thought I would do today, based on what you asked me to do, was actually pick up on my reading of the geopolitical environment that these two things are taking place within. Number one, obviously, the UK itself and how it's going to thrive and prosper in today's world and the world that stands ahead of it. And also perhaps provide a little bit of a backdrop to what I'm sure will be some conversation about what the US elections might mean. I'm not going to go into the US election and my own thoughts about them in my opening remarks, but obviously very, very comfortable and indeed probably necessary to go into it when we get into the Q&A with you and with your guests. So just to start from the top, I'm just going to do sort of 8 minutes or so. When I talk about the geopolitical environment, when I stepped down as the director of Chatham House in the summer of 22, I did a farewell lecture which talked about us being in a divided world. And as time went on, after I stepped down, I was offered a chance to write a book. I realized that my term divided world was the kind of caution you have as the director of Chatham House, not wanting to create too many waves yourself and leave calm seas for my colleagues to be able to splash around in. But I realized that really what I was talking about was a very long-term contest between the United States and China, which I believe is setting the weather not just for the rest of the world, but also for global businesses, including the kind of ones that are joining us on this call. And that the best framing for it, in my mind, I'm afraid, is to call it a new Cold War. This is a contested term even today. Many academics don't like it because they felt they've had one already, and those who specialized in it don't want a new one. For others, if you call it that, you're going to create a self-fulfilling prophecy, and therefore you get a lot of pushback from that standpoint. But my view on this was that it's better to call a spade and then with my sort of policy hat on, try to help governments think about how to make sure it remains cold and that you can still have constructive relationships within a new Cold War, and certainly avoid it going hot. And also to help companies, which is part of sort of half of what I do in my life these days, prepare for what I think is going to be a very long-term change in the global environment, and one that is evolving as we speak. And if I think of it as a new Cold War, if I can carry this analogy on for a second, I would say that it's like being in the 1950s of the last Cold War. We are very much in it, but in the early days, the very uncertain days, with a lot of uncertainty of how it'll pan out. We're not in the 1980s equivalent of the last Cold War, with all sorts of rules and rules of the road, even though those did not take away all of the risks of quite serious things from happening. Let me say a few words of why, what I think is driving this very deep contest between the US and China, and why, therefore, it even qualifies for a new Cold War. And then maybe say a little bit about why, interestingly, in this case, it is not the only big agenda that companies need to be focused on. And then finish up with a couple of comments about opportunities, risks, as one often does. Why is this, in my mind, a new Cold War? Well, for four principal reasons. One is that obviously you've got a rising China that is emerging as the first truly peer competitor to the United States, since the 1945 end of the last Second World War, the end of the Second World War. And certainly the Soviet Union briefly tried to challenge the United States as a peer competitor. When we think about it, it was fairly brief. It probably wasn't more than 30 years. What you now have is America realizing, and I had the opportunity, should we say, to work 15 years of my life in Washington, D.C. I think I have a reasonably good feel for how people think about America's place in the world. Even in the Soviet Union, they didn't see a truly peer competitor, certainly not in terms of economic heft, and certainly not in terms of technological capability. China presents a really seminal threat to the United States on both fronts. If it were just that, it would be fine, but core to my thesis, if I may use that terminology, of this being a new Cold War, is I think both sides fear the other's political system. You could call this an ideological contest, but it's the kind of fear that top-down one-party systems have, Chinese Communist Party, when faced by what they believe are democratic systems led by the United States that are constantly trying to undermine one-party top-down systems of government. And they look to what happened to the Soviet Union. They look at color revolutions that have taken place, in particular in Central Eastern Europe. They look at the Arab Spring or the Arab uprisings, and they think they see a pattern here. So the Chinese Communist Party has been waiting for the moment when America would wake up to the fact that by welcoming China into the global economy, as it did back in the early 2000s, America, in a way, was empowering an inevitable rival. And the steps that China's taken to sort of defend itself from what it assumed would eventually be America's waking up and holding it to account, of course, have confirmed in Washington that they never should have let China grow the way it has in the first place. Many of you on this call will remember the former US Trade Representative Bob Zoellick talking about wanting China to become a responsible stakeholder, i.e., a stakeholder in the American rules-based system, which, of course, China rejects at many levels. And when China has not taken that particular track, but in essence carried on being a Communist Party state and even trying to set up parallel forms of international governance, it has confirmed for many in America that they cannot trust a one-party Communist Party state to be their peer rival, and that things like TikTok or the surveillance state technologies that China is developing and exporting are part of a new form of, just as the Soviet Union tried to export communism globally, you've now got a China that is trying to export authoritarian systems of governance, in a way trying to make the world safe for autocracies, and they're going to challenge it. So each side views the other not just as a peer competitor, but as a competitor that is a threat to its own political system and the kind of political system that they'd like to see spread around the rest of the world, or at least dominant around the rest of the world. So I want to put those points there because I think this is why we've entered a contest that, as far as I can see, is going to go on for many decades. We really are at the beginning of this. This is not a passing fad or moment. It has been sharpened and accelerated, second point, by Russia's invasion, full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 22. Why? Because it forced China to pick sides. China may not be happy that Putin did a full-scale and relatively failed invasion in February, March of 22, but having made that move, the Communist Party of China has no choice but to help make sure that Putin doesn't lose. They don't need him to win, but if he were to lose, that would leave China facing a rampant America that has been building up its alliance networks in the Indo-Pacific and the Asia-Pacific region, that has ended up becoming and looking at China, as I said, as a truly as a sort of epochal threat to the United States. And so what you've got, if you're sitting in Washington, is looking not just as China as a rising threat, but seeing China plus Russia. And if I can give one just little touch point on this, my last trip to Washington about 3 or 4 weeks, actually, last but one trip to Washington, at a particular meeting to talk about China, several Americans now talk about the combined threat America faces from Russian and Chinese nuclear weapons as a sort of combined number, which is going to end up being double the size of America's nuclear deployed arsenal. And so if you're sitting in Washington now, people are starting to talk about a new axis of evil that combines China, Russia, and those two other countries with which China is close and on which Russia now relies to conduct its warfare in Ukraine, Iran and North Korea. And you could not pick, for a Washington standpoint, more of a rogue gallery than that, that grouping. So you've got there in America a sort of a perception that there's a kind of block that they need to face. And third point, if you're on the other side of the ledger, you're sitting in Europe, as we are, we'd always thought of ourselves as perhaps having a third way between America and China, that we wouldn't get caught up in this new emerging contest. But from the moment that China has supported Russia in its war in Ukraine, it has reinforced Europe's move towards America, our reliance on America for our security, our reliance now again on NATO. And we're now finding ourselves looking at China, like America does, as a threat that we need to contest. And we're joined, of course, by Japan, South Korea, and Australia, who now look at Russia and China together and are trying to kind of become part of a bigger team. Let's call it the G7 plus team, the NATO plus team. You've had the prime ministers of South Korea, Australia, and Japan attend the last 3 NATO summits, which talk about Russia and China as a combined threat. So you have a sort of blockism emerging again that carries parallels of the last Cold War. And that very importantly, and this is my last point about the new Cold War, has created a sort of vehicle within which companies are being put onto the front line. The G7 has become a sort of steering committee for how this new Cold War has been conducted. We have nuclear weapons. Neither side wants it to go hot. So we're really operating through import controls, export controls, investment controls, critical supply chain resilience. These are the new terminologies, instrument weapons, if you might want to call it, of this new Cold War, at least in its early days. And that's why, as I said, I kind of insist, if I may, on this concept, because I think companies have no way to escape it. I don't want to spend too much more on my opening remarks. Let me just make 2 closing comments. One, most of the rest of the world, which accounts now, if I exclude China, Russia, Ukraine, and so on, and obviously all of us in the NATO, Atlantic, Pacific, American ally community, we've got 65% of the world population not interested in this new Cold War. They account for close to 30% of world GDP. This would have been in the old Cold War, the non-aligned movement. Now it is a sort of emergent group that's broadly called the Global South, or the countries of the Global South. China would like to bring them onto their side and is trying to use the BRICS and the Shanghai Cooperation Organization and teamings of these sorts to try to say, hey, you should be on our side in this contest. And the Americans are going, no, hold on a minute. No, India, you need to be part of our new Quad that's going to resist Chinese hegemony and the Indo-Pacific. We want you on our side, and we're not going to criticize you for buying, weapons and oil from Russia, despite what's happening in Ukraine, because we want you to think of us as your main ally. These countries, whether it's India or Brazil or Saudi Arabia, take your pick, Indonesia, are able to triangulate this new Cold War in ways they couldn't before. So what you're seeing in a way is, in parallel to this emergent Cold War in the global north, very interesting new business opportunities emerging, both for these countries themselves, but also for investment, not just by Chinese companies or even Russian companies for those matter, or by companies amongst themselves, but obviously for European, American, Japanese, Australian, South Korean companies to get in and, along with their governments, compete for this global South, which contains so many economic opportunities, growing middle class, huge critical minerals for the new energy transition, etc. And I can talk more about that kind of emergent infrastructure for what some people were calling in the IMF World Bank meetings last week, re-globalization, because I think that is a true thing. But my sort of closing comment would be that despite those moments of opportunities, I said right at the beginning, we're in the kind of 1950s moment of this new Cold War. There are no rules. There's no arms control agreements involving China and America. There's no real boundaries to the economic contest. We don't know where Jake Sullivan, the US National Security Advisor's famous small garden to us Brits, and a high fence, which is meant to be very limited technologies that they would make sure China could not get access to. That small yard and fence keeps expanding into new technologies and new areas. We can talk more about that in a minute. We're not sure whether there could be some spillover into some type of hot conflict around Taiwan or the South China Sea. We're struggling to deal with big global challenges like climate change because the whole world has become much more zero-sum. So we are in a very edgy moment, I suppose is a simple way of saying it, and one in which I think companies are going to have to be, including financial institutions, obviously, really alert and keeping a very close finger on the pulse of the new environment, and one in which obviously Britain, with all of its own internal recent challenges and hopefully on slightly calmer waters ahead, is going to be a key player. So I'm happy to take questions in any direction, John, whether we go a little bit more parochially into the UK and how it plays its cards. Obviously, the biggest uncertainty we have right now is where the US election is going to play out. I said I wouldn't go into it in my opening remarks because that's a whole another thing, but why don't I stop there and let you come back in and engage in conversation? Thanks.
Well, thank you very much, Robin. That was an absolute sort of masterclass in quarter an hour of what we're seeing in contemporary geopolitics. Can I just remind everybody on the call, please do use the Q&A function to put your questions in, and I will then read those and put them to Sir Robin. So please keep those coming. But I did want to start with the US actually, really. We're all very focused on elections a very few days away. And I'm not going to ask you to make a prediction because it does look very close at the moment, according to the polling. But I wondered if you could give us a little bit of a sense of the background of why America is not quite the dominant force that perhaps it was in the first Cold War, and where you think it may head over the next 4 years.
Great question, John, especially the way that, if I may say, the way you couched it. My one line on the Trump Harris election, if I can just put it this way, and I'm happy to take it anywhere you may want later on. I've been saying for the last few months, I think it's Trump's to lose, which I just have to remind people when I've said this in other countries I've been visiting in recent months. They keep, oh, you mean Trump's going to lose? And I said, no, it's Trump's to lose. In other words, he should win. He's got the strongest economic argument. He's got a strong immigration argument. I'd say he's even got a strong foreign policy case. But of course, he may not lose it for all the reasons or he may lose it, sorry, for all the reasons we know. But I think it's Trump's to lose. In any case, we'll wait and see what happens. But your point was more about why is America not the power that it was? I mean, I think the first thing we need to realize, first of all, America still accounts for roughly the same proportion of GDP as it did through its heyday. You know, it's not, I mean, it was at 26%, 25% of global GDP at the end of the Second World War. It was at roughly 25, 26% of global GDP at the end, at the end of the last Cold War. And it is, 21, 22% of world GDP at the beginning of the new Cold War. I just want to make that point that, if you just look at it in very raw numbers, and then, America seems to be in an equally dominant position. I could add to that all the things we know. America is almost uniquely well endowed globally. Each time you think it's going to hit some decline, it discovers either new resource capabilities, shale gas and shale oil in the 80s, and then developed in the 2010s, which now has made it the largest oil producer in the world, and possibly the largest gas, certainly close to the largest gas producer in the world. And obviously, we all know at the frontiers of technology, it just keeps breaking through to the next level. So I think the first thing we need to realize that America remains potentially not just the most powerful, but the most influential country in the world. But what's changed fundamentally is it, at some core level, if I can simplify it, it resents the costs of influence and certainly the costs of leadership. And this has been a long time coming, in the sense that the United States, probably from the late 1990s, certainly the early 2000s, with the Iraq War, and then going into the period where the global financial crisis, obviously just 4 or 5 years later, the realization that many, many people in America had lost the American dream. And I have the statistics in my book about, the fact that, now something like only 40% of Americans face the prospect of being better off than their parents, whereas that had been an 80 and 90% number through to the mid-1980s. There's been a real loss of confidence amongst very large segments of the US population that they individually, as Americans, have been benefiting from this heyday, seeming heyday, of American power. So Trump has become the agent for that howl of rage, as you might argue. Some would argue the Brexit debate was the howl of rage for many people in the UK in the same period of 2016. American politicians largely, and this is the most fascinating thing, in a way have abandoned the field of global economic leadership, but have tried to sustain the field of global security leadership. Yeah, they still lead NATO. They're the largest military power. They send their ships all over the world. They've got their bases all over the world. They expect a certain deference in the Indo-Pacific, in the broader South Pacific, in the Gulf, in Europe. But they don't want to be involved in new trade deals. They've pulled back from them. They're now imposing unilateral tariffs left, right, and center. All sorts of, one might say, high-handed and even aggressive moves against allies on technology controls. All of it to try to sort of say to the American people, it doesn't matter whether you're a Democrat or Republican, we care about you, and we're going to try to remold our position in the world stage to your benefit. And that move, of course, might be logical. I understand where it comes from. But having traveled a lot recently in Asia, there's this frustration that just as these countries around the world see their moment of opportunity, if you're in the Asia Pacific region, if you're in the Gulf, if you're India, even if you're Africa, this is your moment of opportunity where you have the burgeoning population, you've got your wind in the sails. And rather than America being your partner, America seems to be making it more difficult for you to take advantage of that moment. So this provides ready support for the Chinese line that BRICS is the kind of answer to American continued economic hegemony, power of the dollar, that is not being used for world benefit. No, it's being weaponized for short-term American geopolitical or even national economic goals. So resentment about the role of the dollar, very difficult to get rid of it. But the new development bank, which is the sort of bank that was called the BRICS Bank, as you will have seen at its most recent meetings, which symbolically coincided with the World Bank IMF meetings last week, it's all the discussion about can we create more alternative currency swaps to trade without dollar. There's not much chance of obviously alternative reserve currencies right now, but there is a shift going on. So sorry, I could go on for a bit longer. Let me just stop. I think the main difference, the reason we have this sort of change in America's global outlook and how people perceive it is the loss of belief amongst many, many Americans that they benefit from global leadership and from the costs of leadership. And the rest of the world is thinking, how do we deal with that? Because in a way, our acceptance of your security position came with you being a team player on the economic side. And if that's withdrawn, everything gets very wobbly. Stop there.
Thank you very much for that answer. Almost prescient, I think, in the sense that there was a question that come in through the Q&A, and please do keep them coming, about international use of the dollar. And I mean, I wondered if you had a sense that this search for alternative currencies in which to trade, and we're seeing interesting trading corridors emerging, which don't go via Europe or via London or via the US. So these are kind of direct linkages. Do you think the international use of the dollar is going to reduce? And then a second economic question, which you might as well pick up at the same time, which also came in, is shared economic priorities, and in particular climate change and the transition investment. How do America and China play proactively and nicely together to tackle that kind of massive shared problem?
No, great. And these are very relevant and good questions. And I'll do my best to answer them. Obviously, people on this call are swimming around this water more than I am. But my sense is that international usage of the dollar for reconciliation of trading relationships certainly is going to continue its gradual and slow decline. I should have the numbers in front of me, but I got some quoted in the book about the rise of the use of the RMB in particular in global trade reconciliation. I know that right now, trade between Russia and China, which, as we know, has increased, doubled pretty much in the last 6 or 7 years to 240 billion or so, is now conducted almost exclusively in each other's currencies. Still, the total number is a low number. I can't remember, it's in single digits, might be use of RMB in global trading is maybe 6%, somewhere around that number. If somebody's got a better one, put it into the chat or into the Q&A. But it remains low, partly because obviously we have the other side of this question, which is that international usage of the dollar is going to remain dominant as the reserve currency, simply because the Chinese are not willing to allow the RMB to be a global storage of value for as long as China is still going through this incredibly difficult transition out of or into being out of the middle income trap and then potentially becoming a middle income country. And given the fact that it's trying to do that in, one might say, unorthodox manners, not developing or allowing the emergence of a true consumer class within its country, trying to rely heavily, for the moment at least, on exports of higher and higher value manufactured goods, this is a really tall order. And therefore, the risks of macroeconomic instability within the Chinese market are high. And therefore, China wants to keep, or the Communist Party wants to keep very tight control over how it uses the RMB as a global currency or not. So you're going to have this sort of weird bifurcation of increasing usage of the RMB and other currencies relative to the dollar for trade reconciliation and for undertaking trade. And more countries wanting that alternative, as we've seen Brazil keen to be part of this. You've got over 10 countries wanting to join BRICS, and the reason they want to do this is not for the political stuff of the BRICS. In fact, they constantly try to avoid that, but they very much like to be part of the new development bank, where they hope they might then get plugged into this, and also, as you know, have access to alternative settlement mechanisms parallel to the SWIFT. And China has its own nascent system of this sort, which is increasingly being used. I think I saw the same article all of you did, that the new, more bifurcated HSBC, the Asian part of that, is now going to be part of that settlement mechanism. So, but we want to remember on the reserve side, what are the alternative currencies to the RMB and the dollar? They tend to be what I would call G7 plus currencies. It's the pound, it's the RMB. The Swiss franc is interesting in that sense, that Swiss are now also involved in imposing sanctions on Russia. Whether they would do that on China is another matter, but it's the yen. Most of the alternative currencies are inside the security economic alliance that is emerging in this new Cold War. So it's a very, it's a sort of changing environment. The only bit I haven't mentioned on this, sorry, I'm going on a bit long in my answer, but it's a big question, which we haven't talked about, and it lets me just amplify a bit my answer to why the US is changing. One of the other big differences between the US today at the beginning of the new Cold War and the US in the heyday of the last Cold War is that over time, once it had paid off its World War II debt, US debt to GDP and kind of market rates, averaged anywhere between 50 and 35% of its GDP. As you know, it's now and been on a huge spike from about 2010, 12 onwards, but is now approaching 100% of GDP and on track, whoever wins the next election, towards 120% of GDP. And given the fact that America's GDP has now continued to grow and has grown relative to China's, we've got the unbelievable number of $36 trillion worth of gross debt. American debt servicing is now equal to the size of its defense budget, roughly $870 billion in debt servicing costs for the United States alone this year. So there's another kind of hanging sword of Damocles potentially behind the dollar, should the US election go in very unpredictable ways and the markets start to kind of believe that maybe American solvency is not as solid, despite all of its tailwinds I was describing earlier, and its ability to keep driving growth, that at some point that sort of growth will always get America out of trouble. If anyone doubts that, boy, we're into a messy period, because as you can tell, I don't see alternatives, and yet the dollar itself becomes risky. I can't even imagine what that does to the global economy. Right. Just very quickly on your second part of the question, apologies, John, and everyone on the call, but these are big and complicated questions. The energy transition in the US-China context. It is very hard to think win-win when the world is zero-sum, which is about lose-lose. And to tackle climate change, which is a global public good, governments need to be thinking about win-win, or at least not worrying about losing more than their rivals might lose. And you will have seen Donald Trump has very effectively weaponized the energy transition as part of this election campaign. If you were to listen to some of his statements and those of his supporters, if you believe in the green energy transition, if you're willing to buy EVs as opposed to nice traditional American gas-guzzling Chevrolets, you are empowering America's avowed rival, China. China is the green energy power. America is the country that relies on its traditional rivers of gold, of drill, baby drill, oil, coal, and gas. And, this plays obviously very well in the economy today, in the political swing states that Trump is trying to win. But there is this worry that China's investment in its new productive forces, as they call it, which is heavily in the green energy transition, is now, rather than American leaders saying to themselves, well, hold on, is that a technology threat to us militarily? Batteries? Probably not. EVs? Shouldn't be. They are now being folded into the security perception because EVs need to have very particular critical minerals in them. Where are those critical minerals sourced from? They're sourced from parts of Africa where China is achieving political dominance and buying the votes of the various countries it invests in Africa for influence in the UN. I mean, that may seem like a strange chain of thought, but I know that chain of thought is one that is alive in Washington, D.C. today. So the Americans are saying to the EU, if you want to be our partner on a green transition, the Biden administration and Harris would say, then we need to have alternative critical mineral supply chains for our green energy revolutions that don't have Chinese products in them. So you don't even need Trump. You can have, a Harris administration making this more complicated. So, John, I see that your camera back on. What I'll say this there very quickly is that I'm afraid for US-China, they haven't quite worked out the boundaries of their contest on the green energy transition yet, but it is a source of geopolitical and geoeconomic competition between US and China and will increase if Trump wins, but will also increase, I think, if Harris wins.
Thanks very much, Robin. Some of the things you covered in that answer actually pick up a few of other questions that have been coming in thick and fast, actually, while you've been talking. And Pete Horrell, I think, raised the very good question. To what extent should the US be worried about self-harming, as it were, if it is unpicking global trade systems and international finance systems? And I think this is not Pete's point, but rather mine, that if you have a debt profile of the sort that the US now has, you have to be very careful to remain a reserve currency, because otherwise there's no way out of that. So, I mean, is the US cautious enough about just what it might do by pursuing greater protectionism and if you like, a bit of isolationism?
No, absolutely. I think, look, it's a key question. We're in a period of transition, to state the obvious, and in this period of transition, when one says self-harm, one assumes there's a self. The one thing we've learned over the last 7 or 8 years, and we probably should have learned earlier, is that there are different definitions of the self. There is the self that says America is about its headline GDP numbers. Yeah, by headline GDP numbers, America is doing incredibly well. But as a very clever, or witty, I should say, member of a public attending a Brexit debate, some of you will have heard this anecdote, but I happen to know the British academic to whom it was addressed back in 2016 when he was trying to explain to an audience, how well Britain was doing inside the EU, and it had the lowest rate of unemployment and highest levels of foreign direct investment and highest levels of GDP growth despite being in the EU. So why would we leave? Before you could move on to his next point, somebody said, that's your GDP, mate, not mine. So who's the self? When we say self-harm, if one's operating in the boardroom of a company and operating on big macro numbers, clearly the US has done incredibly well out of global economic engagement, just like Britain has done very well from being member of the EU, if you looked at the macroeconomic numbers. But I'm afraid we're in divided, polarized societies where there are winners and losers. And the losers, as always happens, which is why protectionism is a very powerful force in domestic politics, losers tend to shout louder than winners. Winners in the case of globalization are relatively concentrated. What has happened is that the losers have become a larger community and have become very vocal. And of course, have now tied a little bit into the geopolitical context as well. So you're right to say it's a potential or even actual act of self-harm to sort of pull America back, which is why the Biden administration is trying to undertake an adjustment. You know, if you listen to Jake Sullivan, he's been consistent, and he gave a speech again to coincide with the World Bank IMF meetings last week to echo the speech he'd given 2 years earlier, where he basically said neoliberalism is dead. The idea of free markets as drivers of global economic growth that is politically sustainable is over. Now, you might have at one point been able to rely on the Republican Party to rebut that in America. No longer. The opposite. Anyone who's a believer in free trade in the American Republican Party today is out. It has become Trumpian in that sense. So the politics right now, maybe you might say, driven partly by the swing state phenomenon, because again, they're fighting for Pennsylvania, Michigan, Wisconsin, Nevada, places which have not really been winners of the globalization debate to date. I'm afraid you might call it self-harm in a macro sense, but politically, I described that Trump always used to talk about America first. What we've had with Biden is Americans first. Yeah, he's tried to say to a particular segment, I hear your pain. And ultimately, this is one last point, we've been competing. This is where the global new Cold War comes into it. We've been competing against a country that does not play by the same rules. And we need to rewrite the rules, because whereas they could undertake a thing called the Structural Impediments Initiative negotiations with Japan in the 1980s, remember Japan looked like it was going to overtake America, undercut all its companies. Americans took one look at this and said, hold on a minute, yeah, we're not having any of that. You're a small country relative to us. You rely on us for your security. We're going to have some negotiations, and you better come up with a good deal. The Japanese realized they were going to lose key market in America, and they relied on America for their security. So they came up with this brilliantly named thing called voluntary export restraints, and the trade deal was resolved. China is not Japan. Rather than being an American ally, it's America's opponent on security. It needs to survive despite America, not with America. And of course, it's 8 times the size potentially of Japan, certainly in terms of population and potentially in terms of economic size. So it's just not possible for Americans to think in the sort of, we're all in it together, grown up global self, or even a whole American self way. Sorry, I'll try to answer the question that way and stop there.
Thanks, Robin. I'm just going to go back to a sort of different theme which has emerged in some of the Q&A, and this is, what should the UK be doing against this background? We've had David Lammy recently back and forth to America, back and forth to China. I mean, is there a specific role for us somehow in this mix, or indeed for Europe? How do we handle it?
How do we handle it? It's such a fascinating question. My last couple of papers before I left Chatham House, and I haven't really written about it since then, gone onto a sort of the more macro perspective, I can call it that, were about the UK's place in the world. So I'm very interested in it. The UK, I think, can survive in this environment, not necessarily entirely for good reasons. If there's a new Cold War, which I believe there is, Britain is important to the United States. America, at least if we have democratic governments and administrations, appreciates the importance of allies. And the UK is a very important ally. It's an important ally because although we're not in the EU, we're one of the key anchors of European security, and we will be as far forward into the future, despite the small size of our military forces, but we have a better culture, deployability, skills capacity. It overlaps with still pretty strong development, a very good intelligence service, cyber capabilities, all sorts of modern capacity. That means the UK punches above its weight, that hackneyed phrase, but it happens to have some truth in this particular sphere. And obviously we're a nuclear power, recognized nuclear power, with a seat at the UN Security Council. So the UK, even outside the EU, is a kind of swing player in global security, and attractive, I might add as well, therefore, to countries in the Gulf, attractive to Singapore or Malaysia in terms of the five-power defense arrangement. I was out there recently, and the Singaporeans are, we need you here, even if you just send the odd boat, that's enough, but we need you because we're a little bit worried about America and what the hell's going to go on here, but just to show that you care. The Japanese, very similar. Obviously, we're now in this AUKUS arrangement with American and so Australia. So the UK has a kind of security role, if I can call it that although we've got very limited material capabilities, they're quite powerful in targeted ways, and they have a value to an America that cares about alliances. Now, if you have an American leader that doesn't care about alliances, Donald Trump, I mean, whatever you say about Trump and whatever he does on the economy or whatever his view is, I happen to think he's not somebody who's out for conflict and war and instability, but he is somebody who does not value alliances at all. Having to be nice to people a priori is the antithesis of the Trump worldview. You negotiate everything from the beginning again. So Britain, like everyone else, would be put on the back foot. The only benefit is our trade surplus with America is pretty low, certainly low compared to the EU, so others would be in the firing line first. But it would be a rocky journey for a democratic government, not least given some of the help that the Labour Party has been given to the Harris campaign, which we've always done, but that doesn't matter. Trump doesn't think about what's always been done. He cares what's been done to him and recently. So it would be a sticky moment for us if Trump wins. Also, because of course, at the core of the of Britain's foreign policy is improving its relationship with Europe first and above all, because European security is central to British security, because improving the UK's relationship with the EU is central to the growth agenda that needs to be magicked out of non-moneyed thin air. In the end, obviously, even though our trading relationship with America is very large, 20% or so of our exports, over 40% of our exports go to the EU and a larger proportion of our imports. So we'd be in a tough position. So sorry, I could go on for a long time. What does Britain do? It's going to be, we're in this position where I'm afraid we have to be a bit more defensive. We can't afford to get on badly with America, whoever plays there, but we have very little influence in America, whoever wins. We lost influence, in particular, having left the EU, because we're no longer useful for our voice in the EU, but we're not big enough to have a direct bilateral influence in the US. If it's on big stuff like competition policy, AI regulation, digital regulation, we get squeezed between the China, EU, US elephants in the room. The only place, I think I better stop here because I'll go on for too long. The only place where I think we can make a real difference strategically is within the G7. That's a place where we have a seat at the table alongside France, Italy, Germany, obviously the EU, importantly, plus Canada, Japan, and the US. And that is the environment, as I said earlier. It's like the steering committee of the new Cold War for the liberal democracies. Trump would probably ignore it for 4 years, but I think it'll survive beyond him, whoever, if a Republican would win again. So that's a space where we need to cultivate those relationships with Japan, with Australia, with South Korea, those and the bilateral relationships. I'm actually at a UK-Germany meeting right now. So I think there's real scope there, clever things for a government to do. I'll stop.
Super, thank you. I'm conscious we're sort of coming towards the end of the.
If you pile in a couple of questions, I'll give one-liners to the last few.
What I wanted to do is there's a sort of theme of several questions that, including Anne-Marie's, which is, companies have been pretty resilient up to now. How should companies be ensuring they handle the changing geopolitical picture in the best possible way. And so it's what is the advice, therefore, to City UK member companies about how they see the world and act in the world? And then there's one other question, which specific one, which is about China's Belt and Road initiative, and what we think might happen to that, particularly in the event of a Trump win. So I think those will be the last ones in the next 5 minutes. But this has been so good. So I'll hand over back to you for those two questions, if I may.
No, thank you very much, John. Then I'll hand back to you. And apologies if I'm giving long answers, but they're big questions, and each thing pings me off in a different direction. How do companies navigate this? I'm trying to boil it down in my own mind. I've come up with a kind of phrase which I should, I suppose, try to I don't know, copyright or something, but it may not be worth copywriting. You can be the judge of that. Sort of A2M2 is my thinking as I've looked at it and said it a couple of times recently. Accept, assess, mitigate, manage. So I believe, and the reason I am being forthright in using the term New Cold War, I think companies need to accept that the environment we're in of zero-sum geoeconomic and geopolitical competition is here to stay for the next 15, 20 years. For as long as Xi Jinping and Putin are in power, definitely, and I think more than likely beyond that. If you accept that, then we are not yet at the end of the ratchet of restrictions on what was the previously logical, market-efficient globalization. So the process of re-globalization, because it's not all bad news, and companies are able to be resilient by being part of the rebalancing to China +1 and getting into growth markets in Southeast Asia, or take your pick, all of that good stuff, is there. But you've got to accept that there is the risk of having some stranded assets. And I don't mean stranded assets for climate reasons. I mean stranded assets where what looked like a very sensible operation, I'll say in China, suddenly you can never get your money out again, or getting your money out, it means breaking some type of sanction you hadn't thought about. So accept the context, assess where are those vulnerabilities, and you can't do that once. So assess what the exposure is of the company to, I'm going to use the term, New Cold War, and the blockism that's coming in around that. Mitigate. What are your mitigation strategies? What are the hedging? Bit more nearshoring here, maybe some literal onshoring there, or just doubling up supply chain somewhere. We all know the terminology, China plus N, China for China. It might end up having to be India for India. I mean, it is not going to be an open market world, I'll say ever again, but for a long, long time into the future. If you throw climate in there, you throw the post-COVID worries about resilience, I just think we're going in that direction in any case, more emphasis on services, trade, etc. And then having to then manage those mitigation strategies on a regular basis. This is a constant, a bit like updating your cyber policy. I found that boards have all gone full in on cyber and are going full in on technology, but in many cases, because boards feel they don't understand those things. But pardon me for putting it this way, but I haven't found a board yet where the senior people don't feel they know the geopolitics. Well, it's one thing thinking one knows the geopolitics. I mean, I think I know geopolitics, but I'm permanently surprised. So I think just because one knows the shape doesn't mean one has got mitigation strategies in place. So that's my quick answer. What does that mean? Just going quickly to Belt and Road Initiative, because it actually does tie in. Belt and Road was China knowing that at some point it would lose probably access to US and European markets at the kind of open-armed approach that it had in the noughties. And also, obviously, China knowing that to be able to feed a more productive, value-added economy, it needed to have really deep, reliable supply chains around, let's call them the countries of the Global South. And they've done a good job on that, but they overextended, they overplayed their hand. In some cases, they overplayed their welcome. And my colleagues at Chatham House have done some very interesting work recently on Zambia, and I think it's Ghana, just looking at the sort of frustrations that have come in. And if you look at what was announced at the last G20 summit, one in India in September of 2023, for the first time, some discussion between the US and the EU on doing big infrastructure investment connecting India, the Gulf countries, and Europe. Hopefully, if we get the Middle East conflicts calmed down, then that will follow fully through. But in the meantime, new rail corridors between Zambia, DRC, and Angola, funded by the US and the EU, getting critical minerals out, but doing it on a new kind of basis. Now, this doesn't need to be done only competitively with China. If you look at the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank, that is actually a really interesting sort of Europe and China and emerging markets all trying to work together, trying to protect some areas for collaborative working in emerging markets. If Trump comes into power, this stuff may all have to go into cold storage for 4 years, because he could get, who knows, depends who his advisors are and how much time he has to listen to them. But I think things could get quite punchy with China in the near term. But if I look longer term, the biggest difference between this Cold War and the last is that China needs a stable world. It is not the Soviet Union. It's definitely not Russia. So my book ends up with how we can keep things cold and not let the hot war go hot, and the kind of framing of a constructive approach. And companies, I think, are going to have space to play an important role in that process, in looking for those opportunities, recognizing the risks of a new Cold War, but trying to keep alive the spaces for cooperation from which we can all win. I'll stop there.
Robin, thank you very much indeed for that. We are out of time. I think you mentioned knowing geopolitics, and I have to say I can't think of very many people at all who know geopolitics better than you. So thank you, very much for your time this afternoon, and I'm sure you will hear A2M2 reflected back at you. And meanwhile, I hope that everybody on this call goes out and reads your book with close attention, because these are exciting times. So thank you, everybody, for joining, and hopefully see you next time. Bye-bye.